For years, I dismissed the Petra theory almost immediately. The theory argues that the earliest Muslims were not centered in Mecca, but in Petra, a city in modern Jordan. According to the theory, Muhammad's original movement was based farther north. Early mosques faced Petra, and only later did Islamic tradition relocate its sacred geography to Mecca. My first reaction was simple. That sounds implausible. But over the last few years, I have changed the way I approach historical questions. When I examined figures such as Abraham and Moses, I discovered something uncomfortable. Human beings are remarkably good at creating traditions, expanding stories, and passing them on as history. The mere fact that a community sincerely believes something does not prove it happened exactly as remembered. So I decided to ask a different question. Not, is the Petra theory offensive to Muslims? Not, does it sound crazy? But what does the evidence actually show? The most famous modern advocate of the Petra theory is Dan Gibson. His argument does not rest on a single piece of evidence. Instead, he presents several lines of arguments that, taken together, are supposed to suggest that Petra was the original center of Islam. The most important argument concerns the Qibla, the direction of prayer. Gibson argues that many of the earliest mosques appear to face Petra rather than Mecca. If true, this would be significant. If the earliest Muslims consistently prayed towards Petra, then historians would have to explain why later Islamic tradition unanimously remembers Mecca. At first glance, this argument is powerful. After all, architecture can preserve information that texts sometimes distort. But the question is not whether some early mosques can be interpreted as facing Petra. The question is whether the evidence forms a clear and consistent pattern. This is where my thinking began to change. Suppose we found dozens of 7th century mosques spread across Arabia, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt. Suppose every one of them pointed precisely toward Petra. That would be extremely difficult to dismiss. It would represent a genuine historical problem for the traditional narrative. However, what many critics argue is that the evidence is far messier than it appears in documentaries. Some early mosques are ruins. Some were rebuilt. Some have disputed orientations. Some seem to point roughly south. Some appear closer to Mecca. Others are difficult to measure with confidence. In other words, critics argue that the data looks less like a hidden Petra consensus and more like the kind of variation we might expect in the 7th century. And that brings us to an important historical fact. The early Islamic world did not possess modern geographic tools. There was no GPS. There were no accurate global maps. Longitude was notoriously difficult to calculate. Even centuries later, determining precise directions across long distances remained a challenge. If early Muslims in different regions produced imperfect qiblas, that would not be surprising. In fact, it might be exactly what we should expect. The second major argument concerns geography. Petra advocates sometimes argue that the Quran describes agriculture, vineyards, olives, and fertile landscapes more consistent with regions farther north than with modern Mecca. This sounds intriguing until we remember that the Quran constantly references places, people, and stories from across the border, Near East. The presence of agricultural imagery does not automatically tell us where Muhammad himself lived. The argument raises questions, but it does not directly place Muhammad in Petra. A third argument concerns external evidence. Critics note that Mecca is not prominently documented in surviving non-Muslim sources before Islam. Compared with major cities of the ancient world, Mecca leaves a relatively light archaeological and documentary footprint. This point deserves serious consideration, but we should also remember that much of Arabia is poorly documented. Many settlements left limited written evidence. The absence of abundant records does not automatically mean a city did not exist or was unimportant to local populations. The question is not whether there are puzzles surrounding early Islamic history. There are. The question is whether those puzzles justify replacing Mecca with Petra. And this is where I think the burden of proof becomes crucial. The Petra theory is not a small correction. It's not like adjusting a date by 20 years. It's not like questioning the reliability of a particular hadith. It is proposing that the sacred geography of Islam was relocated hundreds of miles. Think about what would need to happen. Pilgrimage traditions would need to move. Collective memory would need to change. Sacred history would need to be rewritten. Entire generations of Muslims would need to forget the original location. That is a massive historical claim. Could such things happen? In principle, yes. Human societies can forget things. Traditions can evolve. Historical memory is not perfect. But the larger the claim, the stronger the evidence required. One thing I found interesting during this investigation is that my position is not based on blind trust in tradition. In fact, I have become much more skeptical of ancient traditions than I once was. When discussing Abraham and Moses, I'm willing to entertain substantial legendary development because the evidence is so distant and limited. Muhammad is different. Muhammad lived in the 7th century. We possess early manuscripts of the Quran. We possess inscriptions mentioning Muhammad. We possess early Islamic and non-Islamic references to the emerging Muslim community. The historical foundation is much stronger than it is for many earlier religious figures. That does not mean every traditional story is correct, but it does mean that replacing the entire geographical setting requires exceptionally strong evidence. So where do I stand after examining the Petra theory? I no longer dismiss it as ridiculous. I think the Qibla evidence is the strongest part of the case and deserves serious scrutiny. If it could be demonstrated that the earliest mosques consistently and deliberately faced Petra, I would consider that deeply significant. However, based on the evidence I have reviewed so far, I do not believe the case has reached that standard. I see questions, I see anomalies, I see areas where historians can reasonably disagree. But I do not yet see evidence powerful enough to justify relocating Islam's sacred origins from Mecca to Petra. My conclusion, at least for now, is straightforward. The Petra theory is worth investigating. It is not something that should be dismissed with mockery. But neither is it something that should be accepted simply because it is revisionist or provocative. At present, Mecca remains the better historical explanation, not because tradition must always be right, but because the evidence required to overturn that tradition has not yet convinced me.